At 3:22 a.m. on November 1st, 1968, Petty Officer 3rd Class Harry Kenny stood watch in the guard shack of a floating pontoon, anchored beside USS Westchester County in the Mytho River, 40 miles upstream from the coastal seaport of Vung Tau. The Mekong Delta night was thick with humidity and silence, the kind of quiet that made every ripple in the water sound like an approaching threat. Kenny had been on watch for 3 hours. His M14 rifle leaned against the wooden frame of the shack. He was listening to the water lap against the pontoon when two massive explosions tore through the starboard side of the ship behind him, lifting the 328-foot landing ship tank 6 feet out of the water and ripping a hole in her hull large enough to drive a truck through. The blast vaporized the forward half of the massive teakwood log that served as a fender between the ship and the pontoon. A telephone pole-sized chunk of the remaining timber drove through the aluminum hull like a spear. Kenny's guard shack disintegrated. He vanished in the flash, never to be found. 25 men would die in the next 3 minutes. The Vietkong swimmers who planted those limpet mines had perfected a tactic the U.S. Navy said couldn't work in a defended anchorage. They were wrong. The explosion killed 18 Navy sailors, 5 Army soldiers from the 9th Infantry Division, and 2 South Vietnamese personnel. It was the greatest single-incident combat loss of life for the U.S. Navy during the entire Vietnam War. And it happened because enemy frogmen had mastered an underwater demolition technique that American commanders insisted was impossible to execute against an anchored, defended warship in the middle of a river. Vietkong sappers had been using improvised floating mines and underwater demolition tactics since the early 1960s, but Navy intelligence consistently underestimated their capabilities. The official assessment was clear. Enemy swimmers lacked the training, equipment, and operational discipline to threaten major vessels in defended anchorages. That assessment killed 25 men on a November morning in 1968. Harry Kenny grew up in Philadelphia, the youngest of 4 brothers, in a family that had sent men to every American war since the First World War. His father worked the docks. His oldest brother served in Korea. Harry enlisted in the Navy in January 1966, 2 months after his 18th birthday. He wanted to see the world, serve his country, and come home with the GI Bill. He got boot camp at Great Lakes, engineman training at Naval Station Norfolk, and orders to Vietnam in July 1967. By October 1968, he'd been in country for 16 months. He was 20 years old, an engineman 3rd Class assigned to River Assault Division 111, part of the Mobile Riverine Force operating in the Mekong Delta. The Mekong Delta in 1968 was a warren of rivers, canals, and rice paddies stretching across 15,000 square miles of southern Vietnam. More than 15,000 miles of waterways crisscrossed the region, providing transportation, food, and strategic depth to both sides of the war. The Mekong River itself, one of the world's great waterways, entered Vietnam from Cambodia and split into multiple branches, creating a labyrinth of channels that flowed through dense jungle, mangrove swamps, and endless rice paddies before emptying into the South China Sea. The geography was treacherous. Channels that were navigable at high tide became impassable mudflats at low tide. Sandbars shifted with every monsoon season, turning familiar routes into obstacle courses. The water itself was murky, thick with sediment that reduced visibility to inches. Crocodiles and venomous snakes lurked in the shallows. The heat was suffocating, the humidity oppressive. Soldiers and sailors rotted in their boots. Equipment corroded. Nothing stayed clean for long. For the Vietkong, The rivers were supply routes, escape routes, and highways for moving weapons, ammunition, and men from Cambodia into South Vietnam. They used sampans, small wooden boats that looked like any other civilian craft on the river. They moved at night, staying close to the shore, blending into the civilian traffic that clogged the waterways during the day. They cached weapons in underwater hides, buried ammunition in riverbanks, and stockpiled supplies in villages that looked like peaceful farming communities. The Delta was their home terrain. They knew every bend in every river, every canal, every hiding place. For the United States and South Vietnamese forces, controlling those waterways meant controlling the rice bowl that fed Saigon and the 16 million tons of rice produced annually in the Delta. Losing the rivers meant losing the war. The population of South Vietnam lived in the Delta, more than one-third of the country's 17 million people. The economy depended on Delta rice. The government's legitimacy rested on its ability to protect the Delta's villages and towns. If the Vietkong controlled the rivers, they controlled everything that mattered. The mobile riverine force was the U.S. military's answer to riverine warfare in Vietnam. Established in late 1966, it combined elements of the U.S. Navy's River Assault Flotilla with the 2nd Brigade of the Army's 9th Infantry Division. The concept was based on the French Dynasauts, integrated naval and army units used during the First Indochina War. The Americans improved on the design with converted landing craft, heavily armed monitors, armored troop carriers, and assault support patrol boats. The force operated with a unique combination of mobility and firepower. Navy monitors converted from World War II-era landing craft bristled with weapons, 40mm cannons, 20mm guns, 50-caliber machine guns, grenade launchers, and flamethrowers. Armored troop carriers also converted landing. Craft could transport a full company of infantry directly into combat zones along the riverbanks. Assault support patrol boats served as the destroyers of the river fleet, providing mine countermeasures and fire support. Command and control boats coordinated operations from the water. By 1968, the Mobile Riverine Force operated from floating bases scattered throughout the Delta. Some were anchored LSTs, tank landing ships converted into barracks and supply ships. Others were purpose-built barrack ships, floating hotels for soldiers and sailors who spent weeks at a time on the water. The largest fixed base was Dong Tam, near the town of Mytho, built on 600 acres of reclaimed rice paddies in what became the biggest land reclamation project of the war. Operations followed a pattern. Intelligence would identify a Vietkong concentration or supply route. The riverine force would steam to the area, often traveling all night to arrive at dawn. The assault support patrol boats would sweep for mines. The monitors would take up fire support positions. The armored troop carriers would beach, drop their ramps, and disgorge companies of infantry who would sweep through the target area looking for enemy forces. Firefights were brief and violent. The Viet Cong rarely stood and fought. They would ambush the lead elements, inflict casualties, and melt back into the jungle or disappear into villages. The force was effective but costly. Between January 1967 and June 1968, the Mobile Riverine Force conducted dozens of major operations, killed more than 5,000 Viet Cong, and captured tons of weapons and supplies. But American casualties were high. Nearly 500 soldiers and sailors were killed, and more than 2,500 were wounded. The Viet Cong adapted quickly to American tactics, setting up ambushes with recoilless rifles and rocket-propelled grenades. They mined the rivers and canals, and they developed underwater demolition tactics that targeted the riverine forces' floating bases. USS Westchester County was one of those floating bases. She wasn't the largest or the most modern, but she was essential. Her tank deck carried artillery, ammunition, and supplies. Her berthing spaces housed soldiers and sailors. Her deck served as a helicopter landing pad. She was home to 105 soldiers of the 3rd Battalion, 34th Artillery, and to the crews of Navy River Assault Division 111, about 120 men total. Nearly 300 people lived and worked aboard Westchester County when she was operating in the Delta. Westchester County wasn't designed for this work. Built in 1954 as a Terrebonne Parish-class tank landing ship, she was meant to transport tanks and troops directly onto beaches during amphibious assaults. By 1968, she'd been repurposed as a floating artillery platform and barracks. Her tank deck carried more than 10,000 rounds of 150mm and 155mm ammunition, along with vast quantities of other explosives. 5 Army helicopters sat on her main deck. Her berthing compartments housed sailors and soldiers. She was, in effect, a floating ammunition dump anchored in the middle of a hostile river 40 miles from the coast. On the night of October 31, 1968, Westchester County lay at anchor in the Mytho River near the town of Dong Tam, part of Mobile Riverine Group Alpha. The ship was secured to a floating pontoon, an aluminum Ami barge that served as an auxiliary pier. A massive teakwood camel, a cylindrical log 50 feet long and 4 feet in diameter, floated between the ship and the pontoon to prevent damage when the vessels moved with the current. Security was supposed to be tight. River patrol boats circled the anchorage. A watch schedule kept sailors on guard throughout the night. But the Mekong Delta at night was too quiet, too vast, and too full of shadows for any security perimeter to be truly secure. Vietkong sappers had been studying American riverine operations for 3 years. They knew the anchorage patterns, the watch rotations, the security procedures. They knew that most U.S. sailors expected attacks to come from the shore, from rockets or mortars, not from beneath the water. American commanders believed enemy swimmers lacked the capability to operate at night in swift currents against defended targets. The Vietkong proved them wrong repeatedly, but the lessons never reached the men on the water fast enough to save lives. The swimmers who attacked Westchester County that night were part of a Vietkong underwater demolition unit, trained specifically for maritime sabotage. They were called Dak Kong, Special Action Troops, and they trained for months in rivers and canals throughout South Vietnam and in sanctuaries across the Cambodian border. They learned to swim long distances underwater, using reeds as breathing tubes. They practiced attaching mines to moving targets in darkness. They studied the construction of American ships and learned where to place charges for maximum damage. They were not the poorly trained guerrillas American intelligence described. They were professionals. The limpet mine was a simple weapon, devastatingly effective. A waterproof case containing high explosives attached to a target's hull using magnets. The Vietkong version weighed between 15 and 30 pounds, depending on the mission. Some were improvised from captured American ordnance, others manufactured in underground workshops in the Delta. The detonators were timed, giving the sappers time to escape before the blast. 2 mines placed correctly could sink a ship. 4 mines could destroy it. On the night of October 31st, somewhere between midnight and 3 in the morning, a team of Vietkong swimmers entered the Mytho River, upstream of the American anchorage. They swam with the current, staying submerged, breathing through hollow reeds when they needed air. They carried 4 limpet mines, each weighing approximately 20 pounds. Their target was the largest ship in the anchorage, USS Westchester County. Their orders were simple. Attach the mines to the starboard side, amidships where the ship's fuel tanks and berthing compartments were located, and set the timers for 3 hours. The river current in the Mytho moved at 2 to 3 knots, fast enough to help the swimmers approach undetected, but slow enough to allow precise maneuvering. The swimmers stayed low in the water, using the darkness and the river's natural turbulence to mask their approach. American patrol boats moved along the perimeter, but their sonar wasn't designed to detect individual swimmers. Their searchlights swept the shoreline, not the water immediately around the anchored ships. The sappers reached Westchester County without being spotted. Attaching a limpet mine to a ship's hull underwater in darkness requires training, strength, and nerve. The swimmer must dive beneath the waterline, locate the hull, position the mine precisely, activate the magnets, set the timer, and surface without making noise. The Vietkong sappers did this 4 times. 2 mines were placed on the starboard side, amidships, directly below the operations berthing area and the first-class petty officers' quarters. 2 more were positioned near the waterline, adjacent to the fuel tanks. The timers were set for 20 hours, giving the swimmers time to reach shore and escape before the blast. At 3:22 a.m., the mines detonated simultaneously. The force of the twin explosions was catastrophic. The blasts ripped through the starboard hull, tearing open berthing compartments, fuel tanks, and storage holds. The concussion lifted the 4,080-ton ship 6 feet out of the water and rolled her several degrees to port. The explosions ruptured bulkheads, vaporized the teakwood camel, and sent a massive chunk of timber through the aluminum hull of the adjacent pontoon. The guard shack where Harry Kenny stood watch disintegrated. He was never found. Below decks, the devastation was immediate and horrific. The operations berthing area, where senior petty officers slept, took the worst of the blast. The explosion caved in bulkheads and crushed men in their racks. Some died instantly from the concussion. Others were trapped in twisted metal as river water flooded the compartment. The first-class berthing area, directly above the blast zone, collapsed into the hole. 5 soldiers from the 9th Infantry Division, sleeping in a berthing compartment on the tank deck, were killed when the deck caved in above them. The fuel tanks ruptured. Thousands of gallons of diesel fuel poured into the river and flooded the tank deck, mixing with seawater and ammunition. The ship immediately began listing to starboard as water poured through the gaping holes in her hull. Tons of river water flooded the damaged compartments, pulling the ship lower in the water. The list increased to 5 degrees, then 10. Charts, equipment, shattered glass, and overturned furniture began sliding across the bridge deck. On the bridge, Commander Robert Branin, the ship's commanding officer, faced the worst crisis of his career. Early reports indicated massive casualties, severe flooding, and a real possibility that the ship would capsize or explode. The tank deck was filled with ammunition, and diesel fuel was pooling across the deck. A single spark could ignite the fuel. A fire could detonate the ammunition. The entire ship could become a fireball, killing everyone aboard. Brannan had to make decisions in seconds, with incomplete information and no time for doubt. He ordered damage control teams to the blast area. He ordered the engine room to prepare for emergency beaching. He ordered all hands to battle stations and began coordinating with the other ships in the mobile riverine group for assistance. The radio crackled with urgent messages as word of the attack spread through the anchorage. Within minutes, patrol boats converged on Westchester County, searchlights sweeping the water for additional threats. Medical corpsmen rushed to the damaged areas to treat casualties. Sailors formed bucket brigades to fight fires and pump water out of flooded compartments. In the damaged berthing areas, survivors worked in darkness, lit only by emergency lanterns and the glow of fires burning elsewhere on the ship. The air was thick with diesel fumes, smoke, and the smell of burned flesh. Men used cutting torches and crowbars to pry open twisted hatches and collapsed bulkheads, searching for survivors trapped in the wreckage. Some found shipmates alive, pinned beneath debris or half submerged in flooded compartments. Others found bodies or pieces of bodies scattered across the deck. Petty Officer Second Class John Sullivan, a hospital corpsman with River Assault Division 111, was one of the first responders to reach the starboard side berthing areas. He found carnage, men crushed by collapsing bulkheads, men burned by the blast, men drowning in compartments filling with water faster than pumps could drain them. He worked through the chaos, triaging casualties, applying tourniquets, administering morphine, calling for stretchers. He worked until his hands were covered in blood and his voice was hoarse from shouting for help. The ship's list continued to increase. By Unheard, Westchester County was listing 15 degrees to starboard, and the list was accelerating. Commander Brannan made the decision to beach the ship before she capsized. The nearest shore was a muddy bank about 200 yards from the anchorage. Brannan ordered the engines ahead slow and pointed the bow toward the bank. The ship moved sluggishly, dragging her flooded compartments through the water, listing farther with every minute. At 03:45, Westchester County's bow grounded on the river bank. The ship settled into the mud at a steep angle, starboard side submerged to the waterline, port side exposed to the air. Beaching the ship saved lives. It stabilized the list and prevented the ship from capsizing. It also made damage control easier, allowing repair crews to access the damaged areas from the shore. But it didn't stop the casualties. By dawn, the death toll stood at 25, 18 Navy sailors, 5 Army soldiers, and 2 South Vietnamese personnel. 27 more were wounded, some critically. The injured were evacuated by helicopter to hospitals in Saigon. The dead were placed in body bags and flown to graves registration. The cause of the explosion was immediately obvious to anyone who looked at the damage. The twin holes in the starboard hull, the pattern of the blast damage, the lack of debris from an external projectile, all pointed to limpet mines attached to the hull by enemy swimmers. But the realization that Vietkong sappers had successfully attacked a major U.S. warship in a defended anchorage sent shockwaves through the command structure. If they could hit Westchester County, they could hit any ship in the mobile riverine force, and they had. This wasn't the first time Vietkong sappers had used limpet mines against U.S. Navy vessels. In August 1966, mines severely damaged the minesweeping boat MSB 54 on the Long Tao River. In November 1966, MSB 54 was sunk by mines. In February 1967, mines destroyed MSB 45 and heavily damaged MSB 49. In November 1967, a mine planted by a Vietkong frogman destroyed the repair, berthing, and messing barge YRBM 16 in the middle of the Ham Luang River. Each attack followed the same pattern: swimmers approaching at night, limpet mines attached to the hull, timed detonations, and devastating casualties. Each time, Navy intelligence issued warnings about the threat of underwater demolition attacks. Each time, security procedures were reviewed and supposedly tightened. And each time, the Viet Cong adapted faster than American forces could respond. The problem wasn't a lack of awareness. It was a failure to believe that enemy swimmers could operate effectively enough to threaten major warships in defended anchorages. American commanders underestimated their enemy and men died because of it. The Vietkong underwater demolition units were trained by North Vietnamese Army instructors who had studied Soviet and Chinese naval sabotage techniques. The training program was rigorous and selective. Only the strongest swimmers, the most disciplined soldiers, and the most committed revolutionaries were accepted. Candidates underwent initial screening that tested their swimming endurance, their ability to hold their breath underwater, and their psychological resilience under stress. Many were fishermen's sons, men who had grown up in the rivers and knew the water intimately. Training lasted 6 months and was conducted in remote areas along the Cambodian border and in Viet Cong-controlled zones deep in the Mekong Delta. The first phase focused on swimming and diving skills. Trainees swam for hours in rivers and canals, learning to move efficiently through the water without creating visible disturbance. They practiced breathing through hollow bamboo reeds while submerged just below the surface, a technique that allowed them to stay hidden while moving through areas patrolled by American boats. They learned to dive deep, to navigate underwater by feel, and to surface silently without creating ripples that would give away their position. The second phase covered demolitions. Trainees learned the properties of various explosives, how to calculate the amount needed to destroy different types of targets, and how to construct and arm improvised devices. They practiced with captured American explosives, Soviet-supplied TNT, and homemade charges fashioned from unexploded ordnance recovered from battlefields. They learned to build limpet mines from scratch, using scavenged materials, metal drums for casings, magnets from radios, and generators for attachment, clockwork mechanisms from watches for timers. Everything was improvised, but it worked. The third phase was tactical training. Trainees practiced approaching mock-up ship hulls in darkness, attaching training mines, and withdrawing without detection. They learned to work in teams, coordinating movements underwater where communication was impossible. They studied diagrams of American ships, memorizing the locations of fuel tanks, ammunition storage, berthing areas, and structural weak points. They learned escape and evasion techniques, how to blend back into civilian populations after an attack, and how to avoid American patrols and intelligence networks. The final phase was live operations. Training teams conducted actual attacks against South Vietnamese Navy vessels, small sampans, and isolated American patrol boats. These missions served dual purposes: completing the training and inflicting casualties on the enemy. Successful graduates became members of Dak Kong underwater demolition units, elite sappers who specialized in maritime sabotage. By the time they graduated, these men were elite operators, capable of missions that American intelligence said were impossible. They could swim 5 miles underwater, using only bamboo reeds for air. They could attach a limpet mine to a moving boat in complete darkness. They could infiltrate a defended anchorage, plant charges, and escape without leaving a trace. They were not the poorly trained guerrillas described in intelligence briefings. They were professionals, and they were very good at their job. The mines themselves were often improvised from captured American ordnance. Unexploded bombs, artillery shells, and mortar rounds were recovered from battlefields, disassembled, and repurposed into limpet mines. The explosives were packed into waterproof casings, often made from metal drums or thick rubber. Magnets salvaged from radios, generators, or captured equipment were attached to the casing. Timers were improvised from clockwork mechanisms, batteries, or even French-era landmine fuses. The result was crude by American engineering standards, but devastatingly effective. A 20-pound limpet mine could blow a hole 6 feet in diameter through a steel hull. 2 mines placed correctly could sink a ship. The Vietkong also used floating mines, improvised devices that drifted with the current or were pushed toward targets by swimmers. These mines were often constructed from bamboo frames filled with explosives and encased in waterproof material. They floated just below the waterline, nearly invisible in the muddy rivers of the Delta. Some were command detonated, triggered by a wire leading to shore. Others were contact detonated, exploding when they bumped against a ship's hull. American minesweepers cleared hundreds of these devices from the rivers, but they couldn't stop them all. The Delta had too many waterways, too much vegetation, and too many places for enemy sappers to launch their attacks. By late 1968, the Vietkong had refined their underwater demolition tactics to a lethal edge. They operated in small teams, usually 4 to 6 men, each with a specific role. The lead swimmer scouted the target and identified attachment points. The demolition swimmers carried the mines and attached them to the hull. The security swimmer stayed submerged nearby, ready to engage any defenders who spotted the team. The commander stayed on shore, coordinating the operation and ensuring the swimmers had an escape route. After the mines were attached, the team withdrew upstream or downstream, regrouped on shore, and melted into the jungle. By the time the mines detonated, the sappers were miles away. American countermeasures were inadequate from the start. Patrol boats circled the anchorages throughout the night, but they couldn't detect individual swimmers in the water. Their sonar was designed for submarines and large targets, for metallic objects that reflected sound waves clearly. A human body swimming slowly beneath the surface, especially in the turbid, sediment-filled water of the Mekong, generated virtually no sonar return. The patrol boats might as well have been blind. Searchlights swept the shoreline and occasionally played across the water between the anchored ships, but they were ineffective against swimmers who stayed submerged. The lights created stark contrasts between illuminated areas and shadow, making it harder, not easier, to spot threats. A swimmer who surfaced in a shadow was invisible. A reed protruding an inch above the waterline was impossible to distinguish from floating vegetation. Underwater nets were deployed around some anchorages, weighted chains with mesh designed to snag swimmers or mines. But the nets were difficult to maintain in the strong river currents. The Mekong's flow ranged from 2 to 4 knots, depending on the tide and the season, strong enough to tear poorly anchored nets loose or tangle them with debris. Trees, vegetation, and even the bloated carcasses of water buffalo would float downriver and foul the nets. Maintenance crews had to inspect and repair them constantly. And during those maintenance periods, the anchorages were vulnerable. Some ships deployed concussion grenades on timed intervals, dropping them into the water to create shock waves that would kill or stun swimmers approaching underwater. The tactic was effective in theory, but dangerous in practice. The explosions created confusion, made it difficult to hear or communicate, and occasionally injured American swimmers or divers conducting legitimate operations. And the Vietkong adapted by timing their approach for periods between grenade drops or by approaching from unexpected angles where the shock waves dissipated. Sentries stood watch on the decks of anchored ships, scanning the water with binoculars and night vision equipment. But they were watching primarily for boats, for sampans or motorized craft that might carry rockets or recoilless rifles. They watched the shoreline for muzzle flashes and the sky for incoming mortar rounds. Few were trained to spot swimmers, and even fewer believed that swimmers posed a serious threat. The idea that a man with a mine could sink a 4,000-ton warship seemed absurd, until it happened. The most effective defense was aggressive patrolling by Navy SEALs and Vietnamese Lien Doan Ngoai Nai frogmen. These teams conducted reconnaissance missions along the rivers, swimming at night to search for enemy staging areas. They set up ambushes near suspected infiltration routes, hiding in the reeds along the riverbank and waiting for enemy sappers to pass. They raided villages suspected of harboring underwater demolition units, capturing equipment and interrogating prisoners. When they found a sapper staging area, the results were decisive. SEAL teams would call in airstrikes or artillery, obliterating the camp and killing the sappers before they could launch their attacks. Vietnamese frogmen would engage enemy swimmers in underwater knife fights, grim, silent struggles in the darkness beneath the surface, where the only sounds were bubbles and thrashing. These operations saved lives and disrupted enemy plans, but there weren't enough SEAL teams and LDNN frogmen to cover the entire delta. The Mekong Delta contained more than 15,000 miles of waterways. Task Force 116, the River Patrol Force, deployed about 250 patrol boats, riverine. Even operating around the clock, they could patrol only a fraction of the delta at any given time. The Vietkong had the advantage of choosing when and where to attack. They could spend weeks reconnoitering a target, learning patrol patterns and security procedures, then strike when the defenses were weakest. And the Vietkong adapted constantly. When American forces deployed underwater nets, the sappers brought wire cutters. When patrol boats increased their coverage, the sappers attacked from upstream, drifting with the current past the patrol areas. When ships moved their anchorages more frequently, the sappers expanded their reconnaissance networks and struck targets they'd never hit before. The River War was a chess game, and the Vietkong were always 2 moves ahead. After the attack on Westchester County, the U.S. Navy deployed additional minesweeping boats and increased patrols around anchorages. New security procedures required ships to move their anchorage positions more frequently and to deploy underwater detection equipment. Navy divers were assigned to inspect ship hulls daily for mines, but none of these measures could fully eliminate the threat. The Mekong Delta was too large, the Vietkong too skilled, and the war too chaotic for any defensive system to be foolproof. USS Westchester County remained beached on the Mytho River for 2 weeks, while repair crews worked to patch the holes in her hull. The work was extraordinarily dangerous and technically complex. Engineers first had to assess the full extent of the damage, which meant sending divers into the murky water to inspect the ruptured hull from the outside. The visibility was 0. The divers worked by feel, running their hands along twisted steel and gaping holes, trying to map the damage by touch alone. Once they understood what they were dealing with, engineers designed a cofferdam, a temporary watertight barrier that could be built around the damaged section. Construction crews fabricated the structure from steel sheets and timber, working around the clock in shifts. They drove sheet piling into the riverbed, creating a rectangular box around the starboard side of the ship. Then they sealed the gaps between the sheets with oakum and tar, creating a watertight chamber. With the cofferdam in place, pumps went to work removing the water from inside the chamber. It took 18 hours of continuous pumping to expose the damaged hull. What they found was worse than expected. The twin explosions had torn 2 enormous holes in the starboard side, each approximately 6 feet in diameter. The blast had bent and twisted the structural frames, ruptured bulkheads deep inside the ship, and shattered welds throughout the damaged section. Simply patching the holes wouldn't be enough. The entire damaged section had to be cut away and replaced. Welders worked in shifts, cutting away mangled steel with acetylene torches. The work was hot, exhausting, and dangerous. The ship still carried thousands of rounds of ammunition on the tank deck. Diesel fuel still pooled in compartments. A single spark in the wrong place could trigger an explosion that would kill everyone working on the repairs. Fire watches stood ready with extinguishers. Ventilation crews pumped fresh air into the compartments. Everyone worked with the knowledge that they were perched on a potential bomb. New steel plates were fabricated and welded into place, replacing the sections that had been destroyed. The welds had to be perfect, strong enough to hold against the sea pressure when the ship returned to the water. Inspectors checked every weld with X-ray equipment, looking for cracks or voids that would compromise the integrity of the repair. It was painstaking work, and it had to be done right. The ship had to sail 2,500 miles across open ocean to reach Japan. If the repairs failed at sea, the ship would sink and everyone aboard would die. While the hull was being repaired, damage control parties worked inside the ship to restore damaged compartments. Twisted bulkheads were cut away and replaced. Electrical cables were rerouted around damaged sections. Ventilation systems were repaired or bypassed. The operations berthing area, where most of the casualties had occurred, was sealed off entirely. It was too damaged to repair in the field. That work would have to wait until the ship reached the shipyard in Japan. On November 14, 1968, the cofferdam was removed and the pumps were turned off. River water flowed back around the patched hull. Engineers held their breath, watching for leaks. The welds held. Tugs moved into position alongside Westchester County and began pulling her off the riverbank. The ship came free slowly, settling deeper into the water as she floated. The list to starboard was still pronounced, about 5 degrees, but the ship was floating and the patches were holding. Commander Brainin ordered the engines ahead slow. Westchester County steamed down the Mytho River toward the coast, escorted by patrol boats and monitors. The entire riverine force turned out to watch her pass, sailors lining the decks of anchored ships, hands raised in salute. The ship that shouldn't have survived was heading home for repairs. The voyage home was not easy. Westchester County sailed for Yokosuka, Japan, for permanent repairs, a journey of 2,500 miles across open ocean. Along the way, the ship ran into a typhoon. Rough seas caused cracks and ruptures in the temporary repairs, and the damaged holds began taking on water again. By the time the ship entered Tokyo Bay on November 25th, flooding had overwhelmed pumps capable of moving 3,200 gallons per minute. Parts of the damaged areas were flooded to the waterline, but the crew was ready. Watertight doors and reinforced bulkheads sealed off the flooded compartments, and the ship limped into Yokosuka for dry docking. The 25 men who died in the attack were honored at memorial services in Vietnam and at home. Harry Kenny was posthumously promoted to Petty Officer Second Class. His name is engraved on panel 41W, line 39 of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. The other sailors and soldiers who died are listed on the same wall, their names carved into black granite, along with the 58,000 other Americans who died in the war. For their families, the memorial is a place to grieve. For the survivors, it's a reminder of what they lived through and who they lost. The attack on USS Westchester County was the deadliest single action against a U.S. Navy ship during the entire Vietnam War. But it wasn't the only one. On January 16, 1969, a command-detonated mine sank the utility landing craft YFU-62 on the Mytho River, killing 8 men. In total, Hundreds of American sailors were killed or wounded by mines during the war, most of them in the rivers of the Mekong Delta. The Vietkong's underwater demolition tactics were responsible for a significant portion of those casualties. The lessons from the attack were clear, but they came too late for the men who died. Enemy sappers were capable of attacking major warships in defended anchorages. Underwater demolition was a serious threat that required serious countermeasures. Intelligence assessments that dismissed enemy capabilities as inadequate were dangerously wrong. But the Navy was slow to adapt. Security procedures were tightened after Westchester County, but similar attacks continued throughout 1969 and into 1970. The Vietkong remained a step ahead. By 1970, as part of the Vietnamization program, the U.S. Navy began transferring riverine operations to the South Vietnamese Navy. American advisors trained Vietnamese sailors in mine countermeasures, patrol tactics, and damage control. Vietnamese frogmen, the Lien Duan Nguyen Nai, were trained by U.S. Navy SEALs and underwater demolition team operators. They learned the same tactics the Viet Cong used, and they used those tactics to hunt enemy sappers. The LDNN became some of the most effective counter-sapper forces in the Delta, conducting ambushes and raids against Viet Cong underwater demolition units. But by then, the war was winding down, and American forces were withdrawing. USS Westchester County returned to service after repairs in Japan. She served in the Mekong Delta until December 1970, when she was transferred to the South Vietnamese Navy as part of Vietnamization. Renamed RVNS Mytho, she served with the Vietnamese Navy until the fall of Saigon in April 1975. When South Vietnam collapsed, Mytho was captured by North Vietnamese forces. She was later sold to the Turkish Navy and served under the name TCG Sankaktar until 2014, when she was finally sunk as a target ship. The survivors of the November 1st attack carried the memories for the rest of their lives. Some stayed in the Navy and made it a career. Others left the service and tried to forget. Most couldn't forget. The smell of diesel fuel, the sound of metal tearing, the screams of wounded men, those memories stayed with them. They reunited at veterans' gatherings, told their stories, honored their dead. In 2018, on the 50th anniversary of the attack, survivors and families gathered at the Westchester County Center in New York to commemorate the men who died. A memorial stone was placed near the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., inscribed with the names of the 25 who were killed. The Viet Cong sappers who carried out the attack were never identified. They melted back into the population after the war, if they survived. Some may have died in later battles. Some may have lived to see the reunification of Vietnam in 1975, the North Vietnamese. Government never officially acknowledged the attack or honored the sappers involved. It was just one of thousands of operations conducted during the war, one small part of a much larger struggle. The tactic itself, the use of limpet mines and underwater demolition against ships in defended anchorages, was eventually integrated into official U.S. Navy doctrine. Post-war analysis validated the concept. Modern naval forces still teach variations of the technique, both for offensive operations and for defensive training. Navy SEALs train to attach limpet mines to enemy ships. Navy security forces train to detect and stop enemy swimmers. The lessons learned from the attack on USS Westchester County and from dozens of similar attacks throughout the Vietnam War became part of the institutional knowledge of naval warfare. But for the men who died on November 1st, 1968, those lessons came too late. They died because American commanders underestimated their enemy. They died because intelligence assessments were wrong. They died because the Vietkong were better trained, more disciplined, and more effective than anyone wanted to admit. 25 men killed in 3 minutes by an enemy that wasn't supposed to be capable of such an attack. Harry Kenny never made it home to Philadelphia. He was 20 years old when he died. He wanted to see the world, serve his country, and come home with the GI Bill. He got 18 months in the Mekong Delta, a night watch on a floating pontoon, and a blast that vaporized him before he could even raise his rifle. His body was never recovered. His family received a flag, a telegram, and a hole in their lives that never closed. The other sailors and soldiers who died that morning had similar stories. They were sons, brothers, husbands, fathers. They enlisted for different reasons, served in different roles, came from different places, but they died together in a single catastrophic moment because the defenses they trusted weren't enough. The river was too dark, the enemy too skilled, and the war too unforgiving. The war in the Mekong Delta continued for another 5 years after the attack on Westchester County. Riverine operations continued, casualties continued, and the Vietkong continued to adapt and survive. By the time the last American forces withdrew in 1973, more than 58,000 Americans had died in Vietnam. Most of them were young men like Harry Kenny, doing their duty in a war they didn't fully understand, in a place that seemed impossibly far from home. The attack on USS Westchester County was the deadliest single action against a U.S. Navy ship in the Vietnam War. It was also a wake-up call that the Navy didn't fully heed until it was too late for the men who died. The Vietkong's underwater demolition tactics were effective, sophisticated, and deadly. They were executed by highly trained sappers who operated with discipline and precision, and they worked because American commanders refused to believe that the enemy could be that good. That refusal cost lives. It cost Harry Kenny his life. It cost 24 other men their lives. It cost families their sons, brothers, husbands, and fathers. And it left survivors with memories they couldn't escape and scars that never healed. The limpet mines used in the attack were simple weapons made from scavenged materials and improvised components. But in the hands of skilled operators, they were devastatingly effective. They sank ships, killed sailors, and proved that even the most heavily defended anchorage could be penetrated by determined enemies with the right training and tactics. Modern naval forces remember the lessons. Security procedures around anchored ships are strict. Underwater detection equipment is standard. Divers inspect hulls regularly. Patrol boats circle anchorages constantly. The Vietkong's tactics from the Mekong Delta are studied in military schools around the world, both as examples of effective guerrilla warfare and as warnings about underestimating unconventional threats. But none of that brings back the 25 men who died on November 1st, 1968. They're still gone, still honored, still remembered by the shrinking number of survivors and the families they left behind. Their names are carved into the wall in Washington, D.C., alongside the names of everyone else who died in that war. And every year on November 1st, someone visits those names, touches the cold stone, and remembers a night in the Mekong Delta when 2 explosions tore through a ship and changed lives forever. That's the story of USS Westchester County, a story of underestimated enemies, inadequate defenses, and men who died because the people who sent them to war didn't take the threat seriously enough. It's a story that should have ended differently. It didn't. The river still flows past Dong Tam. The war is over. The ships are gone. But the memories remain, carved in stone, carried in hearts, and told in stories like this one, so that the men who died aren't forgotten, so that the lessons learned aren't lost, and so that when the next war comes and the next enemy develops the next unexpected tactic, someone remembers what happened on a November morning in 1968 when Vietkong sappers proved that even the impossible is possible if you're good enough, determined enough, and willing to swim through the darkness toward an enemy that doesn't believe you're coming. Harry Kenny was standing watch when the explosions came. He never had a chance. None of them did. That's the truth of it. The Vietkong were that good. The defenses were that inadequate. And the war was that unforgiving. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories live.